Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Graham. I'm the Communications and Advocacy Manager at the YWCA National Capital Area. I use she, her pronouns. I really appreciate everyone joining us today for this important Women's History Month film viewing and discussion. As all of us know, women's roles in history are often and far too often pushed to the background or simply left out of the historical narrative. So today we're going to talk about it. We hope you had a chance to watch the film on our other platform. If you did not, it will be available for another day or two. So if you'd like to share with your friends and family, we'd appreciate it. Feel free to email me any thoughts that you have. But today we are joined by the film's director, Katsitsionni Fox. Excited to have her join us today. And I'll go over a little background if you haven't joined us for one of these conversations before. Our Q&A, we're on about 45 minutes, 30 minutes of discussion, and then 15 or so minutes of audience question and answer. I'd like each of you, if you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat, hopefully tell us what you have already learned today and what you hope to take away from this conversation. During our discussion, if you have questions, go ahead and add them to the chat so we can capture them and ask them at the end. I'm going to mute all your lines right now. If you aren't muted, take a second and do so. We will open them up after our Q&A. And as always, we are a 501c3 organization. So this conversation and all the resources shared here are nonpartisan. I'd like to pass it to Monica Gray, our CEO, to do a really quick introduction.
Thanks, Aaron. Thank you all for joining us for this important conversation. I'll say a few very brief words because I don't want to take a second away from what I think will be an extraordinary conversation. But I wanted to share that I came across this film a few years ago when I was looking for a way that we could tell the story of women's rights in this country in a more accurate and honest and truthful way. And when I came across the film, I have to say that the first time I watched it, I cried. The second time I watched it, I got angry. And the third time I watched it, I got action. And I said to myself, you know, sadness and anger can be fuel for a fire, but they are useless in isolation in my office and in my home. And what particularly struck me was I was reminded of those quotes that I won't attribute because, you know, quotes are often attributed to the person who said them the loudest versus the person who accurately said them. But there are quotes that we often hear that go something like, history is written by the victors and history is written by the winners. And I remember in seeing this film, I thought, well, if that is true, then I am grateful that people like Katsitsionni Fox are still fighting the battle and that the war is not over. And so I am grateful for people who find the truth and share it and tell it. And I'm grateful to work for an organization that is part of telling a more accurate story about the past and not just the history that we're told based on those people who think they have won. And so I will move forward with that and thank again the extraordinary leadership of Katsitsionni.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Monica. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that Washington, D.C. Sits on the native and ancestral lands of the Nottiquantish, the Pataskaway, and the Pamunkey peoples. We are grateful and honor them today as we do every day. So, Katsitsionni, I would love for you to introduce yourself to our audience, please.
Sego, Katsitsionni Yungyats, Waxkalewage, Akwazasne Nuat Gidlo. My name is Katsitsionni, which means I make flowers. I'm Bear Clan and I live in Akwazasne Mohawk Nation territory, which has a border running through our community right at the top of what's now called New York State. And happy that you're all here today and looking forward to just chatting a little bit about the film and then answering some questions at the end.
Wonderful.
Did you want me to tell a little bit about what I do right away?
Yes, please.
Okay, so I am a visual artist. I was a teacher for 20 years in my community, teaching in the high school. I taught Native studies, I taught Native film, I also taught traditional arts, and I just left that. It's going on 2 years now, and now I'm doing filmmaking and visual arts full-time. I've been making films for over 20 years in my community and been focusing on stories of Indigenous women and resilient Indigenous women doing cool things. That's the women that I like to follow. And I think in my film work, I do, tell things in history that people don't know. And it's amazing what we don't know. But I really like to focus on women that are moving in an empowering way, like carrying themselves in that way and doing the gifts that they have while they're here. That's the women that I like to follow in my films. So that's been my focus. And right now I'm working on 2 other films, but maybe we'll talk about that later.
Of course. Well, let's start with about Without a Whisper. What was your main inspiration to make this film?
I think my main inspiration was, as an educator for 20 years, it was always difficult to find resources to use in my classroom that were accurate and that were written from our perspective. That was always very difficult. And it was just difficult to find things in general, and our students that are learning about Indigenous people in their regular history classes, they learn, a tiny little bit, in the curriculum. We barely get mentioned, and we're the first people of the land here. So that's always it's always something that's difficult to deal with as an educator, and you really got to go out and find your own resources. And things like films are things that are easy to share in the classroom. And I think that's why I like to kind of stick to the short form too, because it's easier for a teacher to show a 27-minute film than to show an hour and a half film in the classroom. So I guess that was my inspiration. And I had seen Sally Roche Wagner at an education conference that we had here. It was like 15 or 20 years ago. And that was actually the first time that I heard that our women had an influence on the women's rights movement. And I was like, I didn't even know that. And, I think that our young people need to know that. And then the world needs to know that. We need to change that narrative to be more inclusive. And I think that's what we're hoping from the film and from the work we did around the film, is that this will be a different narrative that's added to that history.
Thank you. We talked a little bit about this when we had our initial conversation, but I'd really love for you to share about your idea of why you think it's really important to tell history from multiple perspectives.
I think it brings us together. And I think that people need to see themselves in history, especially young people. And I always find that so sad when our young people are learning about history and they don't see a lot of themselves, or they don't see a positive image of themselves. So I think the more stories we have like that, the better for all cultures. And there's a lot of division that's going on right now, and this, I think, contributes to like bringing people back together and being appreciative and respectful of other people's culture and other people's viewpoints. And so yeah, that's why I think it's important.
Great. I know you talked a little bit about your history as an educator, and your transition into like artistry and filmmaking. How has like doing filmmaking and being in that space changed you? I know you talked a little bit about learning some history of your own peoples that you didn't know, but are there any other moments that you'd like to share with us?
I always learn a lot with every film that I'm making. So I'm learning professionally, like, more things every time I'm making the film, whether it be editing or filming or directing, or I'm always learning something with every project I do. But I always feel like it's such an honor to be able to share space with the women that I'm filming.
Oh.
And I think a lot of the, that the women that I filmed, they're very humble people. And I think often they don't realize the impact that they're having in their communities, and in even in the broader sense too, like with Louise and the work that she's doing, like she has a big impact all across Turtle Island. So I like to be able to do that, to be able to share space with them and learn about what they're doing, and to be able to share that, to share the positive things that they're doing in this moment, right now, through
Yeah.
through our perspective, not somebody else, coming in and doing a story and then leaving. These are people that I have relationship with for the rest of my life. And they're
Yeah,
people that I know.
yeah, I'd love for you to share what I took away from a lot of the film, or one salient point, at least for me, was the role that women play within Native culture, kind of being the leaders, if you will, which is not necessarily what it looks like in the rest of the world. So I'd love for you to share a little bit more about that.
Sure. So I think what I focused on was the role, the roles of Haudenosaunee women, and there's many different nations and some say tribes or whatever across Turtle Island, and they're all different. They're all unique. Many of them are matrilineal, but some of them aren't. So it depends upon what nation that you're addressing. But for our people, the Haudenosaunee, it was more about not that the women were above the men, or that they were the leaders. They were in balance with the men.
Hmm.
So you'd have a chief that gets appointed, and you have a clan mother. They're on equal footing. So, and then in making decisions, there's a whole process to that. So usually when something's going on, the clan mothers will meet with the people and get the voice of the people. Then they pass that on to the chief. Chief goes with her to council. So there's like a whole process where everybody's included and everybody has a voice, and it is a huge responsibility. That role of being a clan mother, being a what they call a Loyane or a Yagoyane, is like it's such a great responsibility to do that. And for the traditional chiefs and clan mothers, it's something that they're doing for their whole life when they get put in that position, and they do it without any pay. They're doing this they're giving up their own time to do this. I mean, a long time ago, before we had money and all that other stuff, that people in the community would just take care of them, and we take care of each other. But nowadays, in a modern world, it's much more difficult, because a lot of them are working full time, and then they're doing this work for the people the rest of their time. So I don't know, I just said a little bit, I guess, about the women's roles, mostly in government. But for the Haudenosaunee, we had balance in all areas, like socially, politically, economically. It was the women that really controlled commerce, which was the food. So deciding, where the food would go, and even when the men went hunting, it was up to the women, who got that food. And so, yeah, there's a kind of a lot to it with the women's responsibilities, I guess.
And even with the origin story, I think was interesting and impactful to me.
Yeah, I had to include that because I think that's where it all comes from. So for us, when you're growing up and that's what you hear, that that Sky Woman came here, and it was a woman that was here first, and everything like follows the line of the women, and that's what you grow up with that worldview. It's much different than being told that like you were pulled from the rib of a man and you're supposed to follow a man around, and like it's much different. So that's why I thought it was really important to include that, and did that through animation. So because we don't have images of Sky Woman or Adam and Eve, so we did that through animation.
No, I really, I didn't know much about it, and I actually enjoyed the animation in the middle, for sure. I'd love to talk a little bit about like what other stories, particularly of Indigenous women, that you think are left out of history, and
you
There's
could
so many, I know.
endless. I mean, I've said it before that I think I could just stay in my community and make films the rest of my life and never run out of things to make films about. When you think about like stories that are historical though, like that's much more difficult because we didn't write anything down.
Mm.
Our people didn't write things down. Everything was passed down orally. So we have those stories. But then when you look at, the way Europeans documented things, they often didn't include women because we weren't important to them, not important enough to write about. So it's actually harder to go back and find written documentation. And then even what you find, you got to remember who's writing it.
Yeah.
So you're looking at it through the lens of a European man that, thinks much differently than we do. So that's, that's a little bit more difficult. But I mean, there's so many things going on right now that to document. And sometimes I really have to, like I'm working on 2 films right now and I'm just trying to, okay, I'll just do these 2 films right now, but there's so much more that's going on that you want to document like right now, things that are happening. So right now I'm doing a film on Indigenous women seed savers. So I'm following 3 Haudenosaunee women that are, really on the ground and planting our seeds and protecting our seeds from, these big chemical companies and making sure they're viable for the future generations and really active in food, which is vital for us to live, but we've become so disconnected from what we're eating and for caring for our food. So that's one of the things I'm working on. And I'm also doing another short film for a series called Reciprocity. And it's really about our connection to the earth. So there's 7 or 8 of us filmmakers from around the world that are doing short films for this series that's going to come out next year. And I'm focusing on a woman from our community, and her name's Jessica Shenandoah, and she's a young woman that's really active in bringing back land-based knowledge that we lost. So things that we used to do, like one of them is, traditional pottery, making mats out of cattails and bulrush and weaving and doing twining and, things that our grandmothers would have done and that we've stopped doing. She's like bringing that knowledge back to the community. So I'm following her doing that work, which is really exciting to watch, that coming back.
Wow. I like wrote notes to remind myself to search as these hit the airways, if you will. I'd love for you to share, like, if you were talking to a young woman who was interested in film and starting this process, what would you share with them about it?
Just do it. Just do it. I mean, right now, I think with what's going on in education that we're seeing some of the states really trying to squash this history, to downplay this history. I think it's more important than ever to be sharing more of our stories. And film is a great way to do that. So I encourage anybody that has a story that needs to be told to do it.
To tell it. Yeah. And feel empowered to tell it.
Yeah. And it's not just film. I mean, there's so many different mediums you can do. You can do podcasts. You can, there's Instagram, there's so many, platforms that you can use to do that.
Well, as we do in these conversations, I like to kind of end our Q&A time with you sharing a little bit about one, how people can support your work, but also if there are any resources for folks that are here that to learn more about yourself or your filmmaking or your community. So I'll give you the platform to do that.
Sure. So the films that I've made, the one that we're talking about now is Without a Whisper. And it can be found by my distributor, Women Make Movies. So if you go on Women Make Movies, their website, you can find that film. And I also did another film, Ohologo Under the Husk, which was about us bringing our rites of passage ceremony back for the young people in our community. And actually, as my daughter and her best friend are the 2 people in the film. And then my other film will probably also be with Women Make Movies. So you can find the films there. And it'd be, it's good. Like I've had a lot of screenings, like I've done these kind of screenings, but I've also done screenings in like community centers, libraries, schools, and things like that. And it's important to have like discussions around that. So that's always good. And even like having it in your school district, wherever you live, like having these films available for teachers to be able to show. And they also have like discussion guides that come with it. So they have that on Vision Maker Media's website, which is where I got my funding from. And sometimes they're on PBS too. So there's different ways to find them. And then you said books too, right? I pulled a few.
Oh
off my
yeah,
shelf.
I would love,
This was the book that Sally wrote that was in the film. And there's a piece in there at the beginning on the Haudenosaunee. She also has another book that's geared towards like adolescent age children, just on the Haudenosaunee women's influence. And you can find that on her website. And I think it's just sallyrochewagner.com or something. She's pretty easy to find. This is a book that I think everybody's been reading. Like everybody talked to says, oh yeah, I've read that book. So Braiding Sweetgrass.
okay.
So I just pulled a few things off my shelf. This one I didn't even get to read yet, but I'm excited to read it. It's called The Seven Circles.
Oh, okay.
So anyway, those are a few of mine that I just pulled out for you guys.
I appreciate that you actually have them to like show that it's great. I can we post this on YouTube, so I'll be able to go back and see them. So well, I will can kind of conclude here and I want to open up the floor to anyone that has a question or a comment. Feel free to come off mute.
Yeah, come talk to me. Are you guys all shy?
I'll jump in. Thank you for doing this film and for participating in this discussion. I've always been troubled by the Seneca conference and the dominance of white women. So as I think about my own journey over the last many years and thinking as a white woman, feeling embarrassed that white women did not involve others. So so this is very powerful to me. Like as Monica said, I was kind of crying, and then I was like, this is really something. So I'm hoping that there'll be more maybe discoveries of women of color, additional women of color that had an impact on the Seneca movement. And so I just want to throw that out there to see if there may be some other thoughts to include a larger group of women in the Seneca movement.
Yeah, I think like that's where they were at that time. So that the European women that were doing this movement, that's where they were at that time. But we're at a different time now.
Yeah.
So we do something different now. So it's important that we get these stories out, and to include all of the stories. Like I'm coming at it from like Indigenous women, but there's all the women have a voice in this, and we haven't heard all of them.
Yeah.
I'd like to just add, I think the movie is wonderful. I came away from it with a sense of enhanced hopefulness for humanity overall.
Oh,
I think
thank you.
part of what you're describing is one part of what has been humanity's crimes against itself.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you speak of balance and not a particular gender being superior to the other, you're talking about a harmony. And through that harmonic, you'll actually get a healing. You create an environment where you're modeling healing, not only for your immediate community that's part of humanity, but for the broader base of humanity.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times, mass media is not reflecting that kind of message, which really is a love message. Mm-hmm. So it's great to see that in any venue, that the message is being put out there. It was also interesting for me. I had a history with Syracuse University, so I was kind of interesting to see that put in there. And they, their particular historical dealing with Indigenous people, and obviously with the Onondaga Nation reservation right next to the campus and the rest. It was an interesting time being a student there. So yeah, I think this is all wonderful. The light never gets put out by the dark. So every time you have one of these types of events, or you speak somewhere or present a story, I think you light an inextinguishable light. So it's great. Congratulations for taking this on.
Thank you. Thanks for the nice words.
So I'd like to say, I'm 80 years old. I was born in Puyallup, Washington. Practically every city in the state of Washington is named for Native people. Seattle, Tacoma, Squamish, Wenatchee. I mean, and yet I basically grew up knowing nothing about the culture. And you've really ignited an interest now in me for learning much more. And I think the wisdom of including women in the governance to realize, I mean, just now corporations are sort of coming around to the notion that maybe we should have diverse views in our executive suites. And really, it stems from people early on recognizing the value of women having a role. Your film is just beautiful. So thank you for making it.
I think that was one of the things that as a filmmaker, I have a short amount of time to tell the story, like 26, 27 minutes. And I'm very mindful of every single word that goes into it. But I also set an intention before I go. And one of the, some of the things that are in the film, I made sure they were in there, for people to know, our influence on the government system was one of them, and then our influence on the women's rights, but creation, all those things, I'm very thoughtful on what I'm going to include in the film. And because is such a lack of knowledge about our people and our contributions, I have to do that. I can't just tell this story. I have to think about the other things that I want to include so people will know it. And so for our government system, we had the first true democracy in the world. And democracy came from our people and spread all over the world, not just here in the United States. But the thing that they left out, and this is what I said in the film, is the women, because they could not wrap their minds around that. But for our people, it makes so much sense that it's the clan mothers that are choosing the leaders, because they're the ones that are watching them grow. They're the ones that are raising those leaders, so they know who's going to be a good fit to take care of the people. And women know that. So I don't know. Yeah, that was one thing they left out.
It's pretty big, pretty big thing to leave out.
Yeah, they also left out, when our leaders even meet today for Grand Council, when all the traditional leaders meet, they always start every meeting doing the opening address, giving thanks to everything on the earth all the way up to the sky, so that their minds are in a good place to do their meeting. And that you don't see that, in Congress, so that's another thing they left out. So there was things they borrowed and things that they didn't pick up that would have been helpful for them.
Thank you very much for this beautiful movie. I had a friend in town and went to the American Indian Museum in Washington, D.C. for another visit. And it just reminded me of the resources there that people should avail themselves of if they're here or if they're coming to visit, because there's a display on treaties, various treaties of the various over the years, and how the United States manipulated the tribes. And it's just it was very, both to understand the culture better and also our own history better. It was a very worthwhile period of time. So thank you very much for sharing. History is everything, in my opinion, being a history major and humble. It's so important. Thank you.
And that's a great museum. I've been there a few times.
To piggyback off of what Mary Jean said, Katsitsionni, and as you mentioned before, one of the things we are struggling with as a nation right now is the attempted erasure of true facts of the painful history of the founding of this modern part of this nation. And I know that one of the stories that they're trying to suppress is a story that almost nobody knows about, which is the story of the removal of Native children from their families and the attempt to erase their history from them. And the ignorant mindset of the people who basically kidnap these children to civilize them. And many of us in the space know what it's like to have people think that have the most uncivilized behavior to supposedly civilize indigenous children as well as enslaved children and other children. And so I was wondering if you had any plans, despite those efforts, to try to tell the story that they're trying to not have told, even though it hasn't been accurately told in the first place?
I haven't like I don't really have any plans to like tell that story, but I've included it in my last two films. So that a little bit about that. And it was funny because I had a editor that was working on my film that was from New Jersey, and she said, I never heard of this. Like she never heard of boarding school. So I imagine it's something that a lot of people don't know about. So I think if we're going at it from different medias, like putting it out there, and I think it might have the opposite effect what they're trying to do, because they're trying to like do that erasure, but when they're doing that, it's getting publicized, so people are saying it.
Exactly.
So I don't know. It's hard. It's hard to. That's a tough one too. That boarding school. It's so hard to go there. Like even though I'm just going there for a little moment in the film. Last year, I went to Rome when they found those graves out in Kamloops. They had a delegation of us that went to Rome to meet the Pope, and that was so hard. Like it's the weight of that is so immense to think about all those children that never made it home, the ones that never were able to start families, and it's yeah, I don't know if I could do that. I don't know if I could make it through, like, to do a whole film on that, but it's something everybody should know that.
Thank you.
I think as you talk about children in particular, globally, children are an extraordinarily abused and exploited part of humanity. And it is a ugliness that is difficult to own in terms of humanity owning it and then us individually owning it.
Mm-hmm.
But to the extent that people have events like this and talk about it, that someone can come out of that conversation to take it on, because it was deliberate. I mean, we've not said that here. We've talked about things being left out, which implies a certain amount of unavoidably or mistakenly or unintentionally. However, this is a very premeditated assault on people. And it's important to not lose sight of that, because in order to respond to a designed attack on humanity, you're going to have the resolve to look at it completely broadly so you can respond effectively. We talk a lot in the last, let's say, 5-10 years about misinformation, disinformation. We now have AI as part of that battle, but disinformation goes back tens of thousands of years. It has been historically chronicled that people have literally changed facts, ignored facts, made up facts, right? And through repetition, tell a story that has nothing to do with the actual experiences of people. So as difficult as this may be, is something that needs to be taken on. I'm not dropping it on you. I'm just saying, as a group here, it needs to be taken on.
Yeah, it's true. It was intentional, and the model that they had here at the Carlisle School was was taken and used all over the world. I was just in Australia a couple weeks ago, and that same model they had over there came from here.
Yes, I've met a couple people from Australia who had given presentations here in the States about their personal experience coming through it, because in Australia, they're actually still doing it. So this is not even quote history yet. This is our current affairs.
Yeah.
Along those same lines, Katsitsionni, do you have some direct work helping young people use, social media and other tools to learn from your work about how to tell those stories? I'm thinking just about a news story I heard yesterday about a young woman here in the United States who's Jewish and who, in response to the growing anti-Semitism in the nation, decided to start telling stories about anti-Semitism around the world, and particularly about the Holocaust because of the efforts to erase that story. And she told a particularly powerful story of her grandmother, who was a survivor of Auschwitz and who at 13 saw her mother taken off to a gas chamber. And she, the young woman who was in her teen years, and her mother and her grandmother went back to Auschwitz, I believe it was last year, and she did a short film on it to talk about and tell that story. And it was extraordinarily powerful, particularly because she used your form of, of a short film, because she wanted her classmates, so she's a teenager, to learn the story. But to your point, understanding that people's attention is short. And I found it particularly powerful and also just brilliant of her to use her platform and her abilities and her skills in the way that you've used yours to tell that story. So I was wondering, have you found a way to encourage, younger folks to tell these stories as well, and to use their platforms and their skills to make sure that regardless of the formalized efforts at the state level on boards of education, to use the media that we know can, surpass those restrictions to tell these powerful stories and make sure that we don't all live in the attempted ignorance that these government leaders are trying to impose on us.
Yeah. Well, when I first got on, I was talking about how I was an educator for 20 years. So I was doing that in my classroom I think I was teaching that class for like 17 years, film class. So students were making, doing projects like that. Also like doing projects related to our culture and bringing more cultural awareness. So, and then now I'm working on films and I have young people on my crew. So yeah, I continue to do that. I'm naturally a teacher, so it's just something I gravitate towards doing.
I have a question. You mentioned earlier, sort of in the process of making this film, that there was like a million things you could never leave the community, and like I'll never run out of stories to tell. Kind of in like the broader sense, and since a lot of us work in, nonprofit and are really passionate about social justice, I think it can feel really overwhelming and in some ways disheartening that there's so much to care about and like so many things that we can, have grievances about and stuff like that. Do you have any advice for like not letting that overwhelm you and dishearten you, but rather sort of motivate you, just given the enormity of like all the things that there are to care about sort of in the world?
Yeah, it's true. I think like for myself, yeah, I know it is overwhelming when you're looking even at all the things that there is to care about, but I think that everybody's put here to do certain work. And I think that you'll feel that like what it is that you in particular can help out with, so that it's not just like such a big burden, but this is something I can do myself. Like for me, I'm doing films or I'm bringing back the art of traditional pottery. So there's things that I feel called to do, and I try to focus on those things. And then even when I'm choosing a film to work on, because it's a difficult process to make a film. It takes me 3 or 4 years to make a short film like that's 26 minutes long. So I have to really has to be something that I'm very passionate about, something that I care about, and really something that I'm pulled to do. Like I'll know it because I won't be able to stop thinking about it. that that's what I'm supposed to do. And I'll blurt it out even before I know I'm going to make the film. I'm like, oh, I'm doing this. And the next thing you know, that's what I'm doing. So I think just following that, where you feel pulled towards, and just focus on that, and not to like overburden yourself with too much, because you're put here to do something in particular.
Listen to your heart, not always your head.
Yeah.
Well, I think we can start wrapping this up. Is there any last minute questions?
I want to thank everybody for coming and for watching the film, and it was good to see everybody's faces, even though it's just virtually. But I hope everybody has a good day, and it was nice spending some time with you guys.
Well, I myself personally, but also on behalf of YWCA National Capital Area, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us. We put on these conversations on a regular basis here at the YWCA. And as always, we appreciate your financial support. So if you were inclined and had a great time today, you can go make a monetary donation at ywcanca.org/donate now. And we are hopeful to see you all both in person, but also virtually in the coming months. We will continue these conversations.
And I'll just say, Katsitsionni, if you find yourself in Washington, D.C. anytime in the near future, please let us know. We'd love to host you here at the YW and perhaps host a film screening of your next films in person. And that we're getting back to that. So please let us know when you're available to come to the nation's capital, because we love to host an in-person gathering to see your next film.
That would be great. I'd love to do that.
Wonderful.
Everybody.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Bye,
Thank you
folks.
all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so
Have a
much.
great day.